Hi, welcome to week 8 of History 358. Last week we talked about the Stalin Revolution. And when we talked about the 5-year plan that Stalin unveils at the end of the 1920s, his grand economic plan to uh, uh, put the Soviet Union back on the fast track toward the construction of socialism, um, we talked about the kind of enthusiasm, the romantic aspect of the Stalinist system, this utopian full speed ahead drive. After the stagnation of NEP, this comes as a great jolt and a great welcome jolt to many in the party who feel that the path to socialism has been slowed down. We need to get back to building socialism fast. And so there's this great sense of heroism. There's this great return to the spirit of the Civil War, right? There is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm. There's a sense of urgency as well. And I want to share with you an image here that I think will demonstrate this quite nicely. An image from the era of the first 5-year plan. Let me, and you see these two locomotives locked in a race. On the left, the red locomotive of the Soviet Union. On the right, a locomotive bearing the swastika representing the fascist capitalist West. And at the top, the question "Kto kogo?", a question posed by Lenin in his writings: who will beat whom? Right? Who will defeat whom? And as Stalin hammered home time and again during the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, our task is to catch up with and overtake the West. So there's this great sense of urgency, there's this great sense of enthusiasm, there's this great sense of pride that goes along with the reconfiguration of society and the economy during the 1930s, as Stalin collectivizes agriculture, as Stalin embarks upon this plan of rapid, full-scale industrialization that Asher talks about in the textbook. Now, if you think about what's going on globally in the 1930s, the Soviet Union's achievements take on an even more striking tone. The rest of the world is mired in the Great Depression. And throughout the early 1930s, Soviet economic output, particularly industrial output, completely overstrips that of the Western capitalist countries, whose economies have been uh, severely hindered by the Great Depression. The collapse of financial markets in the United States and Western Europe after the stock market crash of 1929 lent credence to the Bolsheviks' old arguments that the fall of capitalism was imminent, that the time of socialist triumph was drawing near. And as you see in this Soviet propaganda poster, the overall volume of industrial production from 1929 forward, and you see the USSR continuing to rise while industrial output in the United States, England, Germany, and France has a much rockier downward trend. So in the 1930s, the Stalinist system seemed to many, not just in the USSR, but around the world, to be the wave of the future. Capitalism is done. Liberal democracy is over. And socialism is the way of the future. Intellectuals around the world, workers around the world, were captivated by the enormous changes taking place inside the USSR. And Stalin received enormous credit, both domestically and internationally in certain circles, for the Soviet Union's achievements. And just as an aside, let me add that the industrial achievements of the USSR during the 1930s are principally are the principal explanation for why the USSR, the Soviet Union, is able ultimately in World War II to defeat Nazi Germany. The heroism of the Soviet soldiers, the skills of the Soviet general staff notwithstanding, all of these are factors. The horrific Soviet winters, all of these are important factors. But the industrial base that the USSR is able to create in the 1930s, thanks to the Stalinist 5-year plans, is what allows the USSR ultimately to outproduce Nazi Germany during World War II. So this is a sort of peek ahead to the war years. Now, as we've seen, these transformations were not gentle ones, right? Collectivization and industrialization too came at great disruptive cost. With consider dekulakization, right? Millions of men, women, and children taken from their homes, sent off to Siberia. Consider the loss of life in the man-made famines in Ukraine, the Northern Caucasus, Central Asia. There is an enormous human toll to the transformations that Stalin is unveiling in the 1930s. But at the time, these achievements are heralded as enormous accomplishments. Stalin is single-handedly transforming the Soviet Union from a backwards peasant country ruled by the czars into a modern global industrial superpower. And that's the sentiment expressed in a famous speech that Stalin delivers in 1935. And you see Stalin seated here front and center. Life has become better, comrades, he says. Life has become more cheerful. Just for a minute, since I didn't do this before, let me go to the slides, the slide of terms for today, and you can sort of pause those or take a look at those, get a sense of where we're going for today. This idea that life has become better, life has become more cheerful. Stalin expresses this in 1935. These sentiments had been echoed the year before at the 17th Party Congress held in 1934. We've talked about party congresses as these increasingly sort of ceremonial rituals where members of the party from all across the Soviet Union would come and deliver reports, listen to recitations of the achievements of Soviet industry, Soviet agriculture, Soviet military buildup, etc. So 2,000 party members from all across the Soviet Union attend the 17th Party Congress in 1934, held in the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. And the theater is decked out with red flags, fresh flowers for the occasion. And the party boss of Leningrad, Sergei Kirov, shown here, one of Stalin's right-hand men, Kirov gives a rousing speech at the 17th Party Congress in which he declares that under Comrade Stalin's wise and beneficent leadership, the Soviet people are being warmed by the sun of socialism. And here you see a painting of the 17th Party Congress. Here, Stalin addressing the delegates. You see men and women in various national dress from across the Soviet Union, and everyone has an enormous smile, stormy applause for Comrade Stalin as he welcomes the delegates and proceeds to enumerate the achievements of Soviet industry, Soviet agriculture, so forth and so on. The 17th Party Congress was in many ways kind of the high watermark of the Stalin period. Stalin's former political enemies whom he had outmaneuvered, whom he had reduced to positions of minor importance in the party, or had expelled from the party altogether. They had to come groveling back in, showed up at the 17th Party Congress in the role of humble supplicants, praising Stalin to the skies. Nikolai Bukharin, who had been voted off the Politburo in 1929 for right deviationism, speaks at the 17th Party Congress, praising Stalin as the field marshal of the proletarian forces, the best of the best. Kamenev, who had teamed up with Trotsky and Zinoviev back in the mid-1920s to form the united opposition against Stalin, speaks at the 17th Party Congress to proclaim that the era in which we now live will one day be known to history as the era of Stalin, just as the preceding era entered history as the era of Lenin. One historian describes the 17th Party Congress as Stalin's Roman triumph. And if you think about the spectacle of a Roman triumph in the ancient Roman period, in the days of the old republic or the days of the empire that followed, the conquering hero marches forward, behind him in chains all of his vanquished enemies and all of the spoils of his conquest, right? And this was in many ways what the 17th Party Congress was about, celebrating not only the accomplishments of the 5-year plans, but also to herald the man who had made them possible, Stalin himself. We talked about the leader cult a little bit last week. The Party Congress voted on a resolution, passed a resolution, declaring itself the Congress of Victors. Why? Because socialism has been built. We have achieved socialism under the guidance and wisdom of Comrade Stalin, just as Comrade Lenin said would happen. Just a few years later, the 1936 Soviet Constitution, the so-called Stalin Constitution, declares that socialism has been achieved, and we are now advancing forward toward the radiant future of fully developed communism. So the mid-1930s are times of enormous enthusiasm, times of enormous elation within the party. The task before us, the task of building socialism, has been achieved. The disunity of the 1920s is now forgotten, and under the unifying leadership of Comrade Stalin, we are poised to march forward, a global power, a superpower, poised to march forward toward our next and final goal, the construction of communism. 1,966 delegates from across the USSR attend the 17th Party Congress, the Congress of Victors. By the time the next Party Congress is held in 1939, 1,100 of those 1,966 delegates will have been arrested and shot. Only 59 of the nearly 2,000 delegates to the 17th Party Congress are in attendance at the 18th Party Congress 5 years later. The rest, what happens to them? They perish in the so-called Great Purges, or the Great Terror, which is our focus for this week. So while we've focused so far on the enthusiastic, voluntarist, heroic spirit of Stalinism, this idea of mobilizing the population, making the USSR economically self-sufficient, making the country into an industrial powerhouse, transforming society, transforming culture, making new kinds of people. I want to focus this week, and our readings focus this week as well, on the darker side of Stalinism. And we're going to do that by looking at this window between 1936 and 1938, a period known as the Great Purges or the Great Terror. The period 1936 to 1938 is the time of the so-called show trials, when old Bolsheviks like Zinoviev and Bukharin are put on trial, charged with fantastic crimes against the party that they had served their entire lives. They're accused of being enemies of Soviet power, enemies of the revolution. The period 1936 to 1938 is a period when decorated heroes from the October Revolution and the Civil War could be unmasked and arrested as fascist agents, foreign spies. It was a time when a knock on your door in the middle of the night could well mean that NKVD agents, the successors to the Cheka, agents of the NKVD were coming to take you away for torture, interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. Or if the NKVD weren't there for you, they were there for a father, a mother, a husband, a son. Historians have attempted to make sense of the Great Purges, the Great Terror, and I want to suggest two interrelated prisms through which we can try to understand what's driving this seemingly irrational, seemingly cannibalistic desire of the party to devour itself. And the two engines I want to think about are one, the desire for purity, and two, the fear of conspiracy. And we'll talk about what those mean as we move forward. The Great Purges, the Great Terror of 36 to 38, they don't make sense rationally. They don't make sense economically, right? We can't find an outer logic. We have to think about an inner logic here. And what's impelling the purges, the engine that drives the purges forward, is a drive toward purity. A drive towards purity. It's not about Stalin's own personal psychoses, formidable as those may be. It's not just about Stalin obsessing over the elimination of old party rivals, settling scores with figures who have wronged him in the past. It's not just about one man consolidating power in his own hands. The only way the purges can make sense to us, as they made sense to people living through them in the late 1930s, is if we take ideology seriously, if we take the principles of Bolshevism seriously. And so we need to think about this drive toward purity, the need to cleanse the party of contaminating presences, the need to purify the party from the danger posed by a conspiratorial cabal of enemies who have wormed their way in to the very heart of the party and who want to destroy Soviet power from the inside. And so the party needs to purify itself. The fear of conspiracy, the fear that enemies are everywhere, enemies are in our midst. This is a theme that reinforces the desire for purity. So I want to think about today, this week, as you listen to the lectures and as you read through the readings for this week, including Sofia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya, I want you to think about how the desire for purity and the fear of conspiracy allow us to make some sense of what's taking place in this period, 1936 to 1938. So let's look first at this fear of conspiracy. The terror, the purges of the late 1930s are based on an underlying premise, a sort of axiomatic assumption, namely that there are dangerous elements lurking undercover in the Soviet Union, and that these dangerous elements these enemies, will do irreparable damage to the Soviet project of building socialism and true communism. Now, this is not a new fear, right? The Bolsheviks' search for enemies, as we've seen, goes all the way back to the aftermath of the revolution and the Civil War. NEP, as you'll recall, the new economic policy in the 1920s, had been all about cooperation. It had been all about making concessions, right? Building smychka, building the union between workers and peasants, between the city and the countryside. Stalinism, by contrast, rejects concessions. And so what we see during the Stalin period is a rejection of the bridge building spirit of the 1920s and a return to the divisive black and white us versus them rhetoric that had characterized the years of Red Terror and Civil War. That is reintroduced under Stalin during the period of the first 5-year plan, and it remains in effect all the way until Stalin's demise in 1953. And here you see Stalin, the third figure, Kaganovich, Voroshilov, Stalin, and Molotov, and they are speaking at a party gathering, and behind them is the slogan that we've talked about so many times: there is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm. That Civil War slogan reintroduced during the Stalin years. There's talk of marshaling the nation's forces to do battle on the economic front, right? The industrial front, the collectivization front, the production front, the anti-religious front. And the use of the word front, I think, is quite telling. Soviet economy, Soviet industry, Soviet society itself is portrayed during the Stalin years in these confrontational terms. Society itself is seen as a battlefield, a war zone, which means there are enemies. There are enemies who are clearly visible, and more insidiously, there are enemies who are hiding, who need to be unmasked. This is a poster from the early 1930s showing the Vragi Pyatiletsky, the enemies of the 5-year plan. And we've seen this kind of image before, the sort of usual suspects depicted in their most ferocious, animalistic form, but these class enemies, right? And here we see, for instance, the kulak, the priest, the capitalist, right, with his top hat and monocle. Here you see a shirking worker who takes to the bottle rather than fulfill his quotas, the snarling czarist officer. Here, a Menshevik who's reading the Menshevik newspaper, right? And a new enemy in their midst, the bourgeois specialist. There's this idea under Stalin that it's us versus them. These are the enemies of the 5-year plan. These are the enemies who must be identified and eliminated if the 5-year plan is to succeed. This idea of us versus them plays out throughout the Stalin years. In 1934, Stalin declares that even as the USSR makes the transition into socialism, its enemies, shown here, will make one last, final, desperate assault to bring the whole project crashing down. Stalin warns that class war, class enmity, class division, class hatred will become ever sharper, ever more intense as we enter this final stage. The kulak will become more dangerous. The priest, the capitalist, the left deviationist, the right oppositionist, the industrial wrecker, The activities plotted and planned and executed by these enemies of Soviet power, enemies of the people, will become ever more perfidious, ever more dangerous. And during the period July 1929 to the end of 1933, the number of prisoners incarcerated in Soviet labor camps increases 23-fold. So the statistics seem to bear out this fear. In other words, along with the enthusiasm, along with the elation, along with the sense of pride and achievement that we associate with Stalinism, the flip side of that coin is an almost paranoid, delusional conceit that our enemies are seeking to destroy all that we have accomplished. So, articulated with increasing feverish frequency throughout the 1930s is this idea that enemies are everywhere. Enemies are all over the Soviet Union. They're hatching conspiracies. They're hidden in our midst, and they need to be unmasked. This is an image a little bit earlier from the 1920s, and in a slightly different context. It's poking satirical fun at the idea of the Western powers, the so-called Entente, who hide under the mask of peace, but who are really these fanged, snarling monsters. The same idea is reflected in much of the propaganda from the 1930s. This idea that there are enemies hidden in our midst who are hiding behind masks of peace, hiding behind masks of comradeship and friendliness, so that a respected factory manager might really be an industrial wrecker in disguise. And this word wrecker is a commonly encountered one in the Stalinist 1930s. Anytime a factory failed to meet the excessively high quotas set for it in the 5-year plan, anytime that uh, uh, tractors coming off the assembly line were improperly gauged and faulty from the very start, the Soviet industrial elite had to find someone to blame, right? It's not that the quotas are too high, it's that there are wreckers in the factory who are sabotaging the efforts of Soviet industry. And this idea that a respected factory factory manager might really be a wrecker in disguise, or that a decorated Red Army colonel might really be a Nazi German spy, that your neighbor might be a saboteur, that your coworker might be a secret, hidden enemy of Soviet power, an enemy of the people. This is a very psychologically disorienting conviction. But this is a conviction that we find again and again expressed throughout the 1930s. And if this is the case, propaganda and schoolroom education and factory worker meetings, meetings held on collective farms, instruct men, women, and children across the Soviet Union that vigilance and discipline is always needed. We must always be on guard. We must always be alert, because the enemy hidden behind a mask of peace, the enemy is in our very midst. Who knows? Even your own father might be an enemy of the people. In the 1930s, a little Soviet peasant boy from Siberia, Pavlik Morozov, becomes a kind of cult hero for little Soviet school children and for young pioneers. The story goes that in 1932, Pavlik Morozov, a young pioneer himself, aged 12 or 13, denounced his father to the NKVD. His father was the chair of the village Soviet, the village committee. His father appeared to be a loyal Soviet citizen, a good collective farmer. In reality, he was a kulak in disguise. So Pavlik Morozov's father was arrested, and in retaliation, so the story goes, the little boy was murdered by his relatives, including his own grandfather. After Pavlik Morozov's death in 1932, he is sort of posthumously deified, made into a sort of little godlike hero. Uh, he's celebrated in Soviet children's books, in plays, films, statues like the one you see here, and he becomes a sort of martyr for the cause. He becomes a model for little Soviet children to emulate. There's a Pavlik Morozov museum set up in the provincial city of Sverdlovsk, and it becomes a shrine, in essence, to this little boy now held up as a model Soviet citizen who places his loyalty to the collective above his loyalty to his own family, who places his loyalty to the Soviet system above his loyalty to his own father, and who, recognizing his father as an enemy of Soviet power, does what all good Soviet citizens ought to do: informs the authorities, breaks up the conspiracy, breaks up the plot before it has a chance to materialize and take action. And so Pavlik Morozov, whose story really was a much more sordid and unpleasant one. It seems that the boy had just been murdered over a family quarrel. The political aspect of the incident was much overblown, but he becomes, again, this sort of symbol for vigilance, a symbol for watchfulness. Did people believe that there were conspiracies everywhere? The historian Gabor Rittersporn, whom I've asked you to read for today, read for this week, talks about this idea of omnipresent conspiracy in the 1930s. And this notion of an omnipresent conspiracy is linked to the purges and terror. It helps to make them, as I said, intelligible. The fear of conspiracy is one of those twin engines driving the purges. Let me explain what I mean. There's a slump in industrial production, mid 1936. The harvest of 1936, too, had been less than exciting because, again, in their zeal to overfulfill the plans set for them by economic managers in Moscow, many collective farm managers had expended all of their seed grain the season before. They were left with little to sow, and so the harvest of 36 was an unspectacular one. You have industrial setbacks then in 1936. You have agricultural setbacks in 1936. And this slump in production helped to lend credence to this discourse of wrecking, this discourse of sabotage. Who's behind this? How do we explain this? Well, clearly it's not the party, right? The party, under the leadership of the great wise Stalin, is inerrant, right? The party can never be wrong. Who is to blame? Well, enemies of the people, hiding in our midst, lurking amongst us. They are the ones to blame for slumps in industrial production. They're the ones to blame for a less than spectacular harvest. So everywhere you turned, you encountered this idea. If you pick up a Soviet newspaper from the late 1930s, you can't help but walk away with the impression that everything is on the brink of collapse, that there are enemies everywhere, that there are fascist spies hiding, capitalist wreckers, Trotskyites, Zinovievites, Bukharinites. seeking to wreck industry, agriculture, the armed forces, seeking to betray the socialist homeland and turn it over to its fascist capitalist enemies abroad. So the notion of an omnipresent conspiracy was believable in the late 1930s. It was plausible in the late 1930s at the height of the purges. No matter how far-fetched or preposterous it seems to us today, it was believable and plausible because the discourse of enemy infiltration was itself so all-pervasive. So the discourse of omnipresent conspiracy was itself omnipresent. The idea that conspiracies were afoot was one that you encountered everywhere, in the press, in newsreels, in party meetings, in factory and collective farm meetings, meetings held in the workplace. When you read Sofia Petrovna, think about the content and nature of those office meetings that Sofia is obliged to attend. So there's this fear of conspiracy. The fear of an omnipresent conspiracy is itself omnipresent. I want to talk too about the notion of purity, which helps, again, as I said, to make sense of the purges, helps to make the purges intelligible, and is one of the engines driving the purges. Several weeks ago, when we talked about the origins of the Bolshevik Party, we read the excerpts from What Is to Be Done by Lenin, written way back in 1902. Lenin had argued that the party ought to be small, tightly knit, made up of professional revolutionaries, right? Because the party was the vanguard. The party was leading the workers and peasants forward. He did not want, as the Mensheviks wanted, a mass participatory party. In one of his very final articles, written before his last devastating stroke, Lenin returned to this question of party membership. And the phrase he used, which became the title of the article, was better fewer, but better. In other words, better to have, again, as he had argued 20 years before in What Is to Be Done, better to have a small party made up of better caliber, higher quality members than to have a large party whose membership may not be of the highest order. The irony is, as we've seen over the past few weeks, that the party had swollen to enormous proportions during the Civil War. And again, after Lenin's death, the so-called Lenin levy. So between 1917 and 1921, party membership increases 27-fold. Despite the sort of founding order of the Bolshevik Party, the party is getting bigger. The party is not made up of professional, full-time, hardcore revolutionaries. How can it be if it's that big? The party has to police itself. Between 1919 and 1933, the Party Control Commission conducts periodic purges of the party membership rolls, the party membership books. And this is essentially a periodic audit of party members. They pull out the dossiers, they pull out the files on every party member to make sure that every party member exhibits the kind of proper mentality, proper class origins, proper approach and attitude towards the construction of socialism. We want to make sure that no enemies have crept into the party. We don't want any class aliens. We don't want former czarist officers. We don't want ex-priests. We don't want careerists, those who have joined the party just to get ahead with little to no conviction. We don't want opportunists. We don't want politically suspect elements, right? And when we read the piece by Aaron Soltz We talked a little bit about the party's uh, mechanism for self-policing, for self-discipline. And these party purges that took place in the 1920s, um, you know, in pouring over the party rolls, kicking out those who had entered the party um, without the proper credentials, without the proper conviction. These party purges were often quite um, numerically significant. In the 1921 purge, for instance, a full quarter of party members were expelled from the party, stricken from the rolls. Their membership cards were revoked. So, fulfilling Lenin's precept that it was better to have fewer members but better members. I mention all of this to emphasize the point that the idea of a party purge is not unique to Stalin in the late 1930s. The party had been purging itself at regular intervals from 1919 forward. What is new in the late 1930s, why we speak of the purges with a capital P, is the intensity, the scope of this drive to purity in 36, 37, 38. And the word purge, I think, is a very interesting one to consider here. The word purge in Russian is чистка. And in both Russian and in English, the word purge shares an etymology with cleanliness, with purity. So a purge of the party is all about cleansing the party, cleansing society of enemies, right? So that the party can be rid of these impure, contaminating elements who would do harm to the organism. Events in the 1930s fueled fears that the party was not as pristine as it ought to be. And the most shocking of these took place in 1934. December 1st, 1934, as he was leaving his office at 4:30 in the afternoon, Sergei Kirov, friend of Stalin, party boss of Leningrad, was shot in the back by a man named Leonid Nikolaev. Nikolaev was a party member who had been waiting in Kirov's office building all day, wandering around the corridors, waiting for a chance to speak to Kirov. Nikolaev comes up to Kirov, shoots him in the back, and Kirov dies instantly. Now, the murder of Kirov has attracted the attention of historians since 1934. There's a lot of curious aspects to the murder. And it's also drawn attention because the murder of Kirov really marks the beginning of the purges, the beginning of the Stalinist terror. It's also attracted attention from all manner of conspiracy theorists. Um, Nikolaev himself, the assassin, um, had been roaming around the office, it seems now, for days. He had been stopped by security officers, searched. He was found to have on his person a revolver and an envelope on which he had written the times of day that Kirov came into and exited the building. He had sketched out a map of the building, the office floor, on the back of the envelope. And instead of arresting Nikolaev, the security guards released him and returned his gun, the same gun that he would use a few days later to kill Kirov. The second sort of mystery had to do with Kirov's bodyguard, Borisov, who normally went everywhere, with Kirov, and yet at the time of the murder, Borisov was nowhere to be found. He'd called in sick. The day after, Borisov died in a car crash, the only casualty in a car that had been carrying several passengers. So there's a lot of unexplained aspects of the Kirov murder, and all manner of historians, both Russians and Westerners alike, have tried to crack the Kirov murder, to lay blame at the feet of Stalin or someone else who may have benefited from this. The fact is, Stalin did benefit, in one sense, from the murder of his close comrade. The Kirov murder allowed Stalin to escalate the search for enemies. The fact that Nikolaev, the assassin, was a party member, again, lent credence to the argument that there are enemies in our midst, that the party is harboring impure elements who would seek to deliver, in this case, a fatal blow to the leaders of the proletariat. A lot of people have speculated that Stalin gave the order for Kirov's assassination. Matthew Leno at the University of Rochester has written a massive book on the Kirov murder. I think it's probably going to remain the definitive text. And Leno's conclusion is that there is no smoking gun. There'll never be found a smoking gun. Stalin did not order the murder of Kirov, but Stalin certainly capitalized on Kirov's murder. Here you see Stalin with Kirov, an early photo from the 1920s. And here, Stalin and his comrades bearing an urn with Kirov's ashes, taking them back to Moscow, where they will be laid in a special place of honor on the Kremlin wall. Following the Kirov murder, Stalin emphasizes in speech after speech that the assassination of our beloved Sergei Mironovich, our beloved Kirov, the assassination of Kirov was part of a conspiracy directed not only against Kirov, but against Stalin and the members of the party leadership. Stalin claimed from the very beginning, without any evidence, that the gunman had not acted alone. Nikolaev, the assassin, had acted, Stalin said, on orders from the so-called Leningrad Opposition Center, which was a shadowy network, Stalin claimed, that included such disgraced, expelled party members as Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. And the location of the opposition was no accident. Leningrad had been the site of Zinoviev's political base throughout the 1920s. So what better place for the emergence of a rival opposition center to challenge Stalin and the party leadership? So Stalin says from the very beginning that this is not an isolated instance. Nikolaev was not just a lone gunman, but this is part of a bigger plot. This is part of a bigger story. And that there is, in fact, an organized opposition center calling the shots. There's an organized opposition center that is plotting against Soviet power. In response, now there's no evidence for this. This is simply Stalin's assertions. So when we say that Stalin used the Kirov murder for political ends, this is what we're talking about. Stalin took the murder of Kirov and used it to run forward with this idea of the fear of an omnipresent conspiracy. In the weeks that followed, anyone in the city of Leningrad who had any connection with the so-called political oppositionists of the 1920s, left deviationists, right deviationists are expelled from the city. 40,000 residents from the city of Leningrad disappeared into the labor camps of the Arctic North, disappeared into the labor camps of Siberia. And here you see a typical NKVD mugshot of a young man, a party member, expelled on charges of having uh, unsavory connections with now disgraced party figures from the 1920s. Um, and this is an important point because just having connections to people who are in political disgrace is now, post Kirov, enough to invite state suspicion. It's enough to bring your arrest. Over the course of 1935, Stalin gives the NKVD plenipotentiary powers, which means that they have the power to bypass, if need be, existing law in order to identify and root out enemies. NKVD agents use torture and interrogation during their investigations. They use torture and interrogation methods to induce the accused to sign testimonies. Testimonies asserting that they had been part of this vast, far-reaching conspiracy, a conspiracy organized from abroad by its mastermind, Trotsky. A conspiracy that aimed not only at assassinating Kirov, but at killing Stalin too, overthrowing the Soviet state, destroying the party, restoring capitalism to Russia. Those who were not willing to sign confessions, even after torture, were warned of what would befall their wives and children, or their husbands and children, if they failed to comply. We know from surviving testimony just how brutal, just how painful these tortures were. Consider the Soviet theatrical impresario director Vsevolod Meyerhold. He was a leading figure in the Soviet theater. He was a man of international reputation. He was arrested in Leningrad in June of 1939 on charges of spying for the British and the Japanese. He was beaten within an inch of his life and forced by his NKVD captors to sign a confession. And his police file contains a letter that he wrote the day after signing his confession. He writes a letter to one of Stalin's right-hand men, Vyacheslav Molotov. In that letter, Meyerhold, an incredibly brave, maybe even foolhardy man, recants his confession. He says, forget it. Forget that confession I signed. They beat it out of me. It's not true. I'm not a British spy. I'm not a Japanese spy. How could you even think that? But this is what he says, what Meyerhold says in his letter to Molotov, describing how the NKVD extracted from him this confession. He said, the investigators began to use force on me, a sick man of 65 years of age. I was made to lie face down and beaten on the soles of my feet and on my spine with a rubber truncheon. Throughout the next few days, while my legs were covered with internal bruises and hemorrhaging, they again beat me in the red, yellow, and blue bruises with a rubber strap. The pain was so intense that it felt as if boiling water was being poured over these sensitive areas. I howled and wept from the pain. When I lay down on the cot and fell asleep, after 18 hours of interrogation, in order to go back in an hour's time for more, I was awakened by my own groaning, and because I was jerking about like a patient in the last stages of typhoid fever. It's unclear what Meyerhold was trying to accomplish with this last letter to Molotov. Molotov never wrote back. I think what Meyerhold wanted to preserve in the record was the brutality of his treatment at the hands of his NKVD captors, and also to preserve in the file, to preserve in the record, um, a sense that this is how confessions are extracted. This is how confessions are obtained, by using rubber truncheons and rubber straps to beat it out of the arrested, to beat out confessions from the accused. Even as they are beating so-called enemies of Soviet power, the NKVD is also conducting a proverka, a verification of party records, a verification of party cards. All across the Soviet Union, party members are expected to appear at their local party office, present documentation. Their records are subjected to scrutiny, combed over. Those whose resumes and pedigrees are found wanting will be expelled, purged from the party. And the 1935 verification, the proverka of 1935, shows a party, reveals a party that is disorganized, keeps poor records, is ideologically lazy, culturally backward. 500,000 members are purged from the party thanks to the 1935 proverka. And all across the country, party meetings are held at which members are expected to stand up and confess their earlier mistakes. They're expected to confess to any instances where they had disagreed with or criticized the official party line in any way. And in the 1930s, um, people looking back on the decade before often had occasion to uh, be very fearful of their records in past years. Many of the leaders of the 1930s had been on the side of the so-called oppositionists at one point or another. And now to have to stand up and confess your sins, to engage in what in Russian is called samokritika, or self-criticism, was a very bold and potentially dangerous move. To stand up in front of your neighbors, to stand up in front of your colleagues and coworkers and say, yes, I made the mistake in 1926 of supporting Zinoviev and the united opposition. I repent and recant of my previous errors and declare that I am now and forever loyal to Soviet power. You had to comb over your own past and present your errors to your peers. At the same time, party members are encouraged to denounce their own comrades and colleagues, to unmask any enemies who might be hiding in their midst. To do so, to unmask enemies, uh, was not just a question of being ideologically gung-ho. The Soviet criminal code was rewritten at the height of the purges to include new crimes against the state. It was now a crime to have any ties to individuals who had been denounced, or a failure to denounce enemies was itself a crime. So the idea was that if you did not denounce your coworkers, your family members, your neighbors, your fellow students as enemies, then your hesitancy could be held against you as a crime. So what do you do? How does this change the way that you interact? How does it change the way you live in society? This new culture of fear, this fear of contamination. Well, when someone is expelled from the party and loses his job, the only safe thing to do is cut off all further contact with that person, for fear of being uh, tainted or polluted by association. And we see this in Sofia Petrovna. If a friend or a colleague is arrested it's wise to avoid any further contact with the family, no matter how much you may pity their situation. Wives whose husbands were arrested were advised to seek a divorce as soon as possible because they could be dragged down too. Um, in fact, NKVD Directive number 486 from 1936 declared that wives of enemies of the people were to be imprisoned for 5 to 8 years, and socially dangerous children would be sent to corrective labor colonies. So the only way to protect yourself against reprisal from the state if your spouse was arrested is to divorce your spouse, or else you too will suffer legal consequences. And children, as we've seen with uh, Pavlik Morozov, were encouraged to denounce their parents lest they fall under suspicion. Most, of course, did not. And the Soviet archives, the police archives, are filled with heartrending letters, undelivered, written by little children to their fathers who have been arrested and are awaiting deportation in NKVD prison cells. I'll read you just one of these letters written by a little boy to his father. Hello, Papa. Soon in school, we'll go through the first winter. Come home quickly because it's bad that we have no Papa at home. Mama says you're away on work or sick, so what are you waiting for? Just run away from that hospital. My friend Alyoshenka ran away from the hospital wearing just his shirt. Mama will sew you some new pants, and I will give you my belt. All the same, the boys at school are afraid of me. Alyoshenka is the only one who I never beat up. He tells the truth like me. He is also poor, like us. And one time I had a fever, and I was so sick I wanted to die along with Mother, but she did not want to, so I did not want to either. My hand hurts from writing. That's enough. I kiss you lots and lots. Signed, Igor Yok, 6.5 years old. Igor Yok's father, of course, never read his son's letter, and it remains to this day sitting in a file in the police archives in Moscow. Enemies of the people were not simply executed, they were excised, cut out from the public historical memory. In a very real sense, they ceased to exist on two planes, on the sort of physical individual plane, but also wiped clean from memory. This is a document from Kursk province, written by the local party office to Moscow, dated 1937, and it's a list of town and village names, names of collective farms that have been changed to reflect the new political changes. So towns and collective farms named for enemies of the people have to be renamed, right? So something that we may not have thought about before. Um, Visual evidence, too, of how this manipulation of public memory took place. Here you see a photo of the Soviet premier, Vyacheslav Molotov, seated in the center, in the front row, surrounded by various dignitaries from Central Asia, representatives from the Uzbekistan branch of the Communist Party. On the far right, seated here, is Ava Yenikidze. Yenikidze was an old Bolshevik. He was the former chairman of the All-Russian Executive Committee until he was unmasked in the 1930s as a secret enemy of the people. And then it became necessary to rewrite history, to unmake Yenikidze. He's deleted from all subsequent editions of the photograph, erased from history. To use Orwell's phrase in the novel 1984, he is tossed down the memory hole. Now, we've seen this before. Stalin in the 1920s was a master at the manipulation of public imagery. Trotsky wiped clean here, right? Trotsky is expelled from the party in 27. His role in the revolution is downplayed. here too, an example of Trotsky eliminated, defaced, as it were. Um, we have also not only examples of photos in pre-production, but also surviving books, notebooks, scrapbooks, diaries, journals from the 1930s that were owned by individual citizens, private persons. Um, and these individuals would deface their own books. They would rip out pictures from their own books on their shelves if those pictures were of disgraced uh, individuals unmasked as enemies of the people. So you see that this individual had in his possession a book with a photo of Trotsky reading Pravda. He's done the safe thing here and wiped out Trotsky's face. This person too, and you see a photograph of Stalin seated with various uh, party workers from the provinces. This individual has been unmasked as an enemy of the people, and so has been cut out by the owner of this book, cut out of the book. A photo montage showing Stalin, larger than life, and his trusted Red Army marshals, and you can see the army commanders whom Stalin has purged are torn out of the photograph. Nadezhda Mandelstam, who was wife to the famous poet Osip Mandelstam, who was himself purged for his anti-Stalinist poems, wrote a memoir published in the West in the 1970s, and she talked about what happened every time a new set of enemies was purged. She said, "My daughter Varya showed us her school books. The portraits of party leaders had thick pieces of paper pasted over them, as one by one they fell into disgrace. The children were ordered to do this on instructions from their teacher. And with every new arrest, people went through their books and burned the works of disgraced leaders in their kitchen stoves. In new apartment buildings, which had central heating instead of stoves, forbidden books, personal diaries, correspondence, and other subversive literature had to be cut up in pieces with scissors and thrown down the toilet." So, in all sorts of unimaginable but real, tangible ways, Stalinism mediated these interpersonal relationships in the late 1930s. You didn't know who you could trust. You didn't know what people would think of you in the context of fear, in the context of the purges. Um, Later in the post-World War II period, um, researchers at Harvard University conducted extensive interviews with Soviet citizens who had left the USSR during the war as refugees, made their way to Western Europe or the United States. And these researchers asked people questions about life under Stalinism. One Russian man said, "We tried not to tell anecdotes, jokes, when meeting people we didn't know." Right? A joke is a political act. To laugh at something is a political act. So we don't tell jokes around people we don't know because we don't know if we can trust them. A woman recalled that when my girlfriend entered the party, I couldn't I could no longer tell her everything that I thought. She had to report any comments immediately to the NKVD. The highest ranking of the Bolshevik accused were placed on trial in Moscow. And I don't want to go into great detail here, except that there were a series of three sensational public show trials held in Moscow in 1936, 37, 38. When we talk about a show trial, we're talking about a spectacle. We're talking about a performance. A show trial is carefully staged, carefully orchestrated, carefully choreographed. And the outcome, the verdict of a show trial is known by the organizers well in advance. So the show trial is intended to serve as a spectacle for an audience of domestic viewers, but also an international audience, to prove that there's this extensive conspiracy at the very heart of the party, a conspiracy that needs to be uprooted and exposed. So this bit of visual propaganda, a bit of Stalinist propaganda from the Purge years, shows now disgraced socialist leaders, Bolshevik leaders, feeding at the trough, and they're represented as pigs. You see Trotsky, Bukharin in the center, Rykov on the far left. They're feeding at the trough that says Der Vaterland, implying, of course, that these enemies, now unmasked, now that their real selves are exposed, we see that they are in fact swine in the service, in the pay of Nazi Germany. The prosecutor at the three trials was a figure named Andrei Vyshinsky. One of the great ironies of the show trials is that Vyshinsky himself was a Menshevik until 1922, and here he was accusing the old Bolshevik party elite at the show trials of being disloyal to the party of Lenin, of being treasonous toward the party of Lenin, the party that they had built and served. Vyshinsky was famous for the overblown rhetoric that he used in his condemnatory speeches. He would refer to the accused as bandits, scoundrels, despicable adventurers, trying to trample down the fragrant flowers of our socialist garden with their filthy feet. This is all part of the dehumanization of the enemy. To refer to figures like Bukharin and Zinoviev and Kamenev and Rykov, figures who had once enjoyed enormous respect within the party until they had run afoul of Stalin, to refer to these figures as liars and buffoons, despicable pygmies and puppies raging like elephants, disgusting creatures, foul-smelling heaps of human excrement, despicable bunches of mad dogs and vermin. Bukharin he described as a wretched cross between a fox and a pig. Trotsky was always referred to in Vyshinsky's speeches as Judas Trotsky, which was also a careful, clever way of inserting a kind of anti-Semitic dig at the Jewish-born Trotsky. There was no evidence that could be brought to bear by the prosecution against the accused in the show trials. There was no documentary evidence. All you had were affidavits signed by other defendants attesting to the criminal malfeasance of their fellow men in the dock. So you have a case built on hearsay, a case built on speculative evidence. There's no crime. But again, the crimes have been carefully built. This whole house of cards has been constructed by Vyshinsky and the prosecution to show that the old Bolsheviks, enemies of Lenin, enemies of Stalin, have been laboring to create this culture of conspiracy, culture of fear. Did people believe this? Well, Joseph Davies, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, attended the show trials in 1936. He wrote back to President Franklin Roosevelt that Stalin and company had unmasked a big conspiracy. You'll never believe it. So Davies bought it hook, line, and sinker. Many did. Vyshinsky would conclude his statements with the same summation each time: shoot the mad dogs. And in 1936, 37, and 38, the mad dogs were shot. Here you see the last photo of Grigory Zinoviev, one of Lenin's right-hand men, who had accompanied him back to Russia on the sealed train in April of 1917, now accused of being a fascist agent. shot in 1936. The biggest of the show trials um, held in 1938. Rykov, um, Bukharin, and others shot in March of 1938. The NKVD boss who brought the trials to a successful conclusion was a man named Nikolai Yezhov. And Yezhov's tenure as NKVD chief coincides with the very height of the purges. And so the period 1936, 37, 38 is referred to often in Russian as the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov years, the Yezhov era. And here a classic image of the Yezhovshchina. The caption reads, Yezhov's steel gloves. And you see the vigilant NKVD chief strangling this multi-headed hydra, this multi-headed snake, bearing the faces of Trotsky, Bukharin, Rykov, and the rest. And you see that the viper's tail is twisted into a swastika, making this connection between the exposed enemies of the people and fascist conspiracy. Here again, the strong arm of the proletarian state strangles the poisonous viper, who's wearing glasses just like Trotsky. We will eradicate spies and saboteurs, the Trotskyite, Bukharinite agents of fascism. As NKVD chief, Yezhov sets quotas for enemies of the people. For each district across the USSR, the search for enemies, too, is subject to Stalinist models of centralized planning. Right? Just as every factory is told how many tractors to produce, Yezhov, as head of the NKVD, tells local state and party officials how many enemies of the people they must produce in a given quarter. The search for enemies widens. The fear of conspiracy ends up fueling itself. And the interrogators themselves fall under suspicion. Eventually, if you keep naming names and if you keep pressing for names to be named, you'll run out of names until the names come back to you. And this is what happens with Yezhov. Yezhov himself falls under suspicion. He's too vigilant, Stalin fears, and he is dismissed. Yezhov is arrested, charged with spying for Poland, Germany, Britain, and Japan, charged with plotting a coup d'etat against the Soviet regime. Yezhov is shot and subsequently erased from history, like so many thousands of his victims. Yezhov falls at the end of 1938, and with the fall of Yezhov, the party backs off of its purge mania. At the 18th Party Congress in March 1939, Stalin tells the delegates that mistakes have been made. The purges have gotten out of hand because of men like Yezhov, Stalin says. The NKVD had its own problem with enemies, its own problem with saboteurs. The NKVD let the purges go on too far. The NKVD let things get out of hand. And henceforth, Stalin promised party members he personally would protect their security. How many victims, if we add up the victims of the terror, the purges from 36 to 38, you'll read wildly divergent figures in various sources. Tens of millions, no. Declassified documents from state and party archives suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of 900,000 Soviet men and women were shot during the period 1936 to 1938. At its height in 1937, that's an average of 1,000 executions a day. The population of the labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia, which we'll talk more about in weeks to come, stands somewhere around 3 million. Who are the victims of the Great Terror, the Great Purges? Well, the economic, industrial, military elites are decimated. The people's commissars who control the branches of government um, fall hard. The party leadership falls hard. As I said, there were 1,966 delegates to the Congress of Victors in 1934. Only 59 returned to the next party Congress in 39. Uh, the purges fall hard on the old Bolsheviks as well, that cohort of senior party members with long histories, long resumes of service to the party. The army and navy were wrecked to the point that Hitler and the Germans assumed that it would be an easy thing to invade and conquer the Soviet Union because Stalin has already destroyed his general staff. One thing I want to point out in closing here, as we sort of think about the purges, is that there's a great deal of emphasis on Stalin's role. We know that Stalin personally signed thousands of execution lists. And he did so very capriciously. He would receive execution lists from the NKVD, and Stalin would go through them very carefully. He'd cross out a name, not this guy. Or he'd add a name. Why not shoot this person? Stalin took this very seriously. Executions are signed in Stalin's own hand. Molotov, Voroshilov, these are the guys in the photo, Khrushchev, they all signed these because Stalin told them to sign. But if we look at the purges as purely a top-down phenomenon, we miss an important dynamic. There's a bottom-up dynamic to the purges as well. Without the involvement of Soviet citizens, without the active participation of elements across Soviet society, the purges could never have reached the heights that they did. What we find in studying the period 36 to 38 is a citizenry that is very much active in, engaged in, pushing forward the momentum of the purges. So it's not simply the state acting on an inert, impassive block of society. What you find in diaries and letters and journals throughout the late 1930s is this widespread anxiety, a widespread fear that all this talk of conspiracy is real, that there are enemies everywhere. And that credulity is what allows Rittersporn to sort of take his sort of the sort of jumping off point for Rittersporn's article. And it shows us, I think, the degree to which Stalinism was successful in mobilizing the population. Soviet citizens didn't just pay lip service to the ideals and slogans of the Soviet state. They internalized them. They believed them. There's an anecdote in the memoirs of Yevgenia Ginsburg, who was arrested at the height of the purges as an enemy of the people. She was a school teacher in the provincial town of Kazan, and she watched as her colleagues were arrested one by one on charges of being a Trotskyite, a Zinovievite, and then eventually they came for her. And she spent years in a Siberian labor camp and returned to tell her story. But she writes in her memoirs, after watching yet another colleague get arrested, she says, has it even been proven that he's a Trotskyite? And her friends respond, he's been arrested. Surely you don't think anyone would be arrested unless there was something definite against him. Think about in Sofia Petrovna. She believes that her Kolya, her beloved son, is innocent. But every other woman in line to pass on a package or a letter to her son is the wife or mother of an enemy of the people. And that's not just an artistic conceit. That, I think, reflects this idea that people didn't simply pay, as I said, lip service to slogans. They internalized them. They believed them. And so I think this shows the inner logic of the purges. The purges make sense in the context of this omnipresent conspiracy, which itself makes sense in the context of the prevailing political discourse of the late 1930s, which is one of irreconcilable opposition between us and them. And the purges are not a deviation. The purges are not an aberration. The purges are the terrible realization, the terrible culmination of this Leninist drive to purify the party, to purify society, to purify the self. And that's there, I think, from the very beginning. That drive to purify, it reaches ridiculous heights or depths under Stalin. But Stalin does not invent this. Stalin is symptomatic of, not indicative of, this drive. So I want to think this week as you read through the readings, especially as you focus your attention on Sofia Petrovna, I want you to think about how the purges affect ordinary people in the Soviet Union and how ordinary people act during this period of fear. What pressures do the purges place on interpersonal relationships? What strains do the purges place on human interaction? So let's focus this week on the darker side of Stalinism. And I will turn off the share and turn off our video, and I will see you all on Friday. So come with questions. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.